The cookhouse bell rang at 5 in the morning and the men came out of the bunkhouse in the dark. They came out in December when the temperature was 15 below, and they came out in August when the mosquitoes rose in clouds from the slash, and they came out on Sundays when the saws were quiet. The bell-organized principle of the logging camp. Before it rang, nothing started. After it rang, nothing waited. Historian Stuart Holbrook described 19th-century New England logging camp food as salt pork, beans, bread and molasses, and tea, black tea strong enough to float an axe on. When the lumberman's frontier moved west in the 1880s, the competition for labor forced the improvement. The camp cook by 1900 was often the highest-paid employee on the payroll. 15 forgotten logging camp meals that fed America's forest workers. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Number 15. Salt pork and beans. The fuel before anything else. The salt pork and beans that fed logging camps through most of the 19th century was not a recipe. It was an infrastructure decision. Salt pork preserved without refrigeration, weighed little relative to its caloric value, was available from any wholesale provisioner at roughly 8 cents a pound in 1890, and could be incorporated into virtually every dish the camp kitchen produced. Dried beans at 5 cents a pound stored indefinitely and expanded during cooking to feed more men than the raw weight suggested. Together they sustained men burning upward of 5,000 calories a day in the cold. The salt pork was fat and salty and slightly smoky. The beans were dense and savory and rich from the pork fat they had absorbed during the long simmer. The tea was black and very strong. Not a meal designed for pleasure but for performance, and it performed that function for approximately 40 years until the competition for labor in the Pacific Northwest forced the improvement that produced what logging camp food eventually became. The combination worked. The men stayed standing and the trees came down, which was the transaction. Number 14. Beanhole beans. The overnight method. The beanhole was dug near the cookhouse, lined with hot coals, the sealed cast-iron pot of beans and salt pork lowered in Saturday evening, the hole covered with earth, and left until Sunday morning. Dried navy beans at 5 cents a pound in 1890, salt pork at 8 cents, molasses at 30 cents a gallon. The beans that came out of the hole had been cooking at low, even heat for 12 to 14 hours, dense and rich and smoky, absorbing the fat of the salt pork, sweetened by the molasses. They smelled of molasses and pork and the wood smoke that had heated the coals the night before. Beanhole beans were Sunday breakfast in logging camps from Maine to Minnesota through the 1890s. The method is older than the logging camp. The logging camp kept it because one fire, 12 hours of cooking, and no attention overnight was the correct equation for a cook who had to be up before dawn regardless. The pit did the work. The cook slept. Number 13. Sourdough flapjacks. The 5 in the morning production. A logger in a Pacific Northwest camp at the turn of the 20th century might eat flapjacks, eggs, bacon, fried pork, hash, potatoes, oatmeal, prunes, donuts, and biscuits, according to camp records, at a single breakfast before dawn. The flapjacks were central, made from a sourdough starter the cook maintained continuously, ladled onto a cast-iron griddle greased with lard, cooked until golden at the edges and set in the center, stacked 6 or 8 to a plate. Flour cost approximately 3 cents a pound in 1895. The flapjacks were thick and slightly sour from the starter, golden on the exterior, soft and dense inside, served with molasses or butter. Eaten fast, the man who lingered was the man who got to work late. The pancake griddle ran for 2 continuous hours. 2 hours, 80 men, before dawn. Number 12, daily bread, what the baker made before dawn. The bread baked daily in a Pacific Northwest logging camp cookhouse by 1910 was produced in quantities most people would classify as industrial. One account from Washington State describes a camp baker producing 78 loaves of white bread per day for a crew of approximately 80 men. Flour at 3 cents a pound in 1910. The bread was a plain white yeast loaf risen near the wood stove, baked until the crust was golden and slightly firm, the interior dense and warm. Bread was never rationed in a well-run logging camp. The cook who rationed bread was the cook the men nailed a note to, the logging camp method of communicating that the time for cooking had ended and the time for leaving had come. Loaves produced before sunrise by a baker who had been at the oven since 3 in the morning, more needed by the following morning. The oven never rested, and neither did the baker, and neither did the obligation the camp had incurred when it hung the sea. Oak House bell and rang it at 5 and told the men that food would be waiting. Number 11. Molasses. The sweetener that ran through everything. Molasses arrived at the logging camp in large barrels, 30 cents a gallon in 1885, and left the logging camp dissolved into nearly every dish the cookhouse produced. It went into the bean-hole beans. It went into the bread as a light sweetener in the dough. It went onto the flapjacks as a syrup and into the hot tea as a substitute for refined sugar. In the early logging camps of New England and the Great Lakes, molasses was the primary sweetness in a diet that otherwise ran towards salt and fat and starch. It was dark and thick and slightly bitter, with the warm sweetness of fermented cane that distinguishes it from refined sugar. A pour of molasses added approximately 60 calories to the biscuit at 5 in the morning in a Michigan logging camp in 1875, and that fact was understood by everyone present, cook, logger, teamster, and molasses barrel, to be among the most important facts of the day. The logging camp cook was called the cookie, or the old man, and ranked as the most important person in camp who did not hold an axe. The quality of the food he produced determined whether the crew stayed for the season or walked to a camp where the food was better, and the crew walking was the camp operator's worst outcome, because a logging operation that lost its men mid-season lost its investment in the timber stand as well. The good camp cook commanded $40 to $60 a month in 1900, plus room and board, when an ordinary logger made $26 to $35. Some followed their regular crew from camp to camp over multiple seasons, the men choosing the operation based partly on where the good cook had signed on. If the loggers did not like the food, they nailed some of the cook's hotcakes to his door. This was the notice. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We have more of this list. Number 10. Mulligan Stew, the anything goes pot. Mulligan stew served as the logging camp's culinary safety valve. Whatever was available, whatever was left over, went into a large pot with potatoes, onion, and water and became the noon meal or the late supper for men who had been working since before sunrise. A pot of Mulligan stew in a Michigan logging camp cost approximately 10 cents per man in 1895. The contents varied by season and by what the supply wagon had most recently delivered. Salt pork or fresh beef or corned beef, whatever vegetables the camp had on hand, sometimes dried beans, sometimes barley as a thickener. The stew was warm and savory and thick, the potatoes soft, the onions sweet and collapsed into the liquid. Warm, filling, present. At the end of a 10-hour shift, those three qualities were enough. Number 9. Prune pie, what the loggers called logging camp pie. The prune pie appeared on logging camp tables from New England to the Pacific Northwest because dried prunes survived the supply chain intact. Fresh fruit spoiled on the supply wagon. Dried prunes at 6 cents a pound in 1895, soaked overnight, became a soft, dark, sweet filling for a 2-crust pastry shell baked in the camp's oven. The crust was lard-based, dense, slightly flaky, pale gold at the top where the oven heat had browned it. The prune filling was dark and sweet and slightly tart, the fruit now soft and jammy after the overnight soak and the oven time. The loggers called prune pie logging camp pie because it appeared so consistently on camp tables that it had become identified with the environment rather than the ingredient. A slice of prune pie in a logging camp was not a dessert in the way that word is used for a finishing flourish. It was a caloric delivery mechanism. It delivered the calories. It also tasted good, which the men noticed. Number 8. Biscuits from the dripping pan, the fat-to-bread calculation. The biscuits made in logging camp cookhouses were lard biscuits, flour, baking powder, salt, and lard mixed with cold water or buttermilk, cut and baked in a hot oven until the tops were golden and the bottoms were slightly crisp and the interior was warm and soft and slightly rich from the lard. Lard from the camp's salt pork processing cost effectively nothing, a byproduct of the pork work the cookhouse was doing for other purposes. Flour at 3 cents a pound in 1895. The biscuits arrived warm, stacked in a cloth, eaten with butter and molasses or pulled apart and dropped into the beans. The bread between the bread baking days. Biscuits waited for no one. The fire did not wait either. The biscuit and the fire understood each other. Number 7. The lunch bucket. The noon meal in the woods. In larger Pacific Northwest logging camps from roughly 1905 onward, the men who went into the woods carried a metal bucket packed by the cook before breakfast. 2 or 3 meat sandwiches, a boiled egg or two, a piece of pie or a donut. A lunch bucket at a Pacific Northwest camp in 1915 cost the operation approximately 15 cents per man to pack and contained approximately 1,500 to 2,000 calories. The sandwiches were cold by the time the men ate them at noon. Everything in the bucket was cold. The men ate standing or sitting on a log in whatever section of the forest they had been working since 7 in the morning. The meat in the sandwich was whatever the cookhouse had produced the day before: roast beef, corned beef, sliced ham, fried pork, cold and slightly firm and slightly salty between 2 slices of the daily bread. Cold meat on cold bread in a cold forest. The men ate without ceremony. Then they went back to work. The bucket was returned to the cookhouse. The next day, it was filled again. Number 6. Corned beef and potatoes, the canned goods era. The arrival of commercially canned corned beef at the logging camp around the 1880s in the Pacific Northwest changed what the camp kitchen could do with protein when the supply wagon was behind schedule. Canned corned beef at approximately 12 cents a can in 1895 provided pre-cooked, pre-salted beef that needed only heating rather than extended cooking. Combined with boiled potatoes and onion, the corned beef produced a thick, savory, dark hash in which the meat broke apart into irregular pieces that absorbed the starch from the potato and the sweetness of the browned onion. A pot of corned beef hash fed a crew of 40 for approximately $200 in 1895. The canned goods era did not eliminate the camp cook's skill. It extended the range of conditions under which the crew could be fed a hot meal. The supply wagon could be 3 days late. The corned beef was already there. Number 5. Oatmeal porridge, the winter morning staple. Oatmeal in the logging camp of the 1890s was whole or steel-cut oat, requiring 30 to 40 minutes of simmering, started by the cook well before the rest of breakfast was underway. Rolled oats cost approximately 4 cents a pound in 1890. The porridge arrived thick, slightly gluey, warm and slightly sweet, with a well of molasses in the center, and sometimes a pour of evaporated milk over the top. Logging season in Michigan and Minnesota ran through the coldest months because frozen ground allowed the timber to be hauled out efficiently. The oatmeal porridge in January in the Upper Peninsula, temperature outside below 0, was not breakfast in the usual sense. It was internal heating before 8 hours in the cold. The men and the oatmeal both understood this. The oatmeal had been started an hour before the men woke up. It knew. Number 4. Camp donuts. What the cook made after the bee. Red. The donuts produced in a logging camp cookhouse were made by the gross, fried in lard in a large pot over the cookstove, pulled out golden and slightly crisp on the exterior, dusted with granulated sugar, stacked on the counter for the men to take with their coffee. Lard from the camp's own processing. Flour at 3 cents a pound in 1890. The donut was the between meal item, not part of the formal breakfast or dinner service, but available at the cookhouse throughout the day for the man who was cold or hungry between meals, or who had started before the breakfast bell and would not stop until the darkness made the work impossible. The donut was dense and slightly sweet and warm when fresh, firm and slightly greasy when cooled. Both states were acceptable. The camp donut was not evaluated for delicacy. In a well-run cookhouse, it was always present. A cook who ran out of donuts heard about it. Number 3. Sunday roast beef and potatoes. The weekly recognition. Sunday in the logging camp, the camp cook produced the meal the men were working toward all week. Roast beef, a round or chuck roast or a standing rib, put in the oven early Sunday morning and roasted until the exterior was dark and slightly caramelized, and the interior was pink and savory, served with boiled potatoes. Beef at roughly 10 cents a pound in 1900. The Sunday roast formed the meal that camp operators used to retain men who might otherwise have walked to a camp with better weekday food. The word would travel that such and such operation put beef on the table every Sunday, and that word mattered. It was the closest thing the logging camp offered to what the men had eaten at home before they went to the woods. Warm and savory and slightly pink at the center. The men ate it without speaking, the no-talking rule at most camp tables, but the speed of their eating told the cook what he needed. D to know. Fast eating meant a good Sunday. Number 2, the camp cook. Who the cookie actually was. The logging camp cook was not a convenience hired from the nearest town. He moved from camp to camp with his reputation, knowing how to produce 80 servings of warm, savory beef stew and 40 loaves of bread before noon from a wood-fired cook stove. A camp cook in the Pacific Northwest earned $40 to $60 per month in 1900, plus room and board. The men respected him not because the camp rules required it, but because they had eaten his food and understood that the alternative, the camp with the bad cook, the cold beans, the flat bread, was the camp they did not want to be in. The no-talking rule at the logging camp table existed partly to speed the meal, and partly because a table of 70 men who were allowed to complain could escalate faster than the cook could respond. The cookie's authority was real and informal and enforced by the men themselves. Some followed him across multiple seasons. Some winter, some camp, the same cook. This constituted the highest loyalty the logging camp offered. Number 1. The cookhouse bell. What time it was? Everything on this list was organized by a bell. The bell hung outside the cookhouse, struck at 5 for breakfast, at noon if the crew ate in camp, at 6 for dinner. A set of cookhouse bells for a camp of 70 men cost approximately $3 in 1895. The bell organized the camp the way a clock organizes a city, by marking the moments that mattered. Before the bell, sleep. After the bell, food, warm and savory and hot, waiting on the table in the dark. After the food, work. After the work, another bell. The bell is gone from the woods. The men who came running when it rang are gone from the woods. The record of what they ate, the salt pork, the bean hole, the flapjacks, the bread, the prune pie, the Sunday beef, is what remains. Drop in the comments if you have a famine, a member who worked in a logging camp. Because the men who cleared the American forest were fed, and the food they ate is part of the story of the forest. And the story of the forest is not finished.